that. Alright. Should be fine. Alright. So, we're on part 2. So, it's going to be books 3, 4, and 5 out of the Gallic War. And that should get us to the halfway point, hopefully, if I can do the 2 hours today. We'll see. Alright, the third book, 56 BC. AUC, I guess that's after founding, 698. Consuls Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus, Marcellinus, Lucius Marcius Philippus. Campaigning against maritime tribes, Crassus and Aquitania. 1. When Caesar set out for Italy, he sent Servius Galba with the 12th Legion and a section of the cavalry to the lands of the Nantuates, Veragri, and Siduni. These lands reach from the territory of the Allobroges, Lake Lemanus, and the river Rhone up to the peaks of the Alps. His reason for sending Galba was that he wanted the pass over the Alps, which traders habitually used, albeit with great danger and on payment of a heavy toll, to remain open. Caesar gave Galba leave, if he considered it necessary, to post his legion in the area for the winter. Galba fought a number of successful engagements and stormed several of the enemy's forts. They all then sent him envoys, surrendered hostages, and made peace. Then Galba decided to station 2 cohorts among the Nantuates. He himself wintered among the Veragri with the remaining cohorts of his legion, in a place called Octodurus. This village, which is set in a valley, has no large area of level ground around it, but it is bordered on every side by lofty heights. As it was also divided in 2 by a river, Galba left one half of the village for the Gauls, and after evacuating its inhabitants, assigned the other half to his cohorts. He fortified the place with a rampart and ditch. 2. Several days in winter quarters went by, and Galba gave orders for corn to be transported to Octodurus. Then suddenly he learned from scouts that during the night the Gauls had all left the part of the village he had allotted to them. Also that the heights which loomed over the village were occupied by a great host of the Siduni and the Veragri. The Gauls' decision to renew hostilities and attack the legion had emerged for a number of reasons. First, they were contemptuous of a legion below full strength, which was short of 2 cohorts, as well as a number of men sent out in small groups to forage for supplies. Moreover, because the ground was uneven, they thought that when they ran down from the heights into the valley and threw their missiles, our men would not even be able to withstand their first assault. There was also the fact that they were aggrieved because their children had been taken from them as hostages, and they were convinced that the Romans were trying to seize possession of the peaks of the Alps, not just to make their route easier, but in fact to take control of them forever, and to annex the lands bordering the province. 3. Work on the winter quarters and the defenses was not quite completed, nor had the supply of corn and other necessaries been adequately secured, for Galba had assumed, following the surrender and delivery of hostages, that there was nothing to be feared in terms of an attack. On hearing this news, therefore, he quickly called a council and asked for opinions. The threat had arisen most unexpectedly, and they now saw that almost all the heights were filled with a host of armed men, so that there was no chance of help arriving or of supplies being brought in, as the access routes were all shut off. Hope was all but abandoned at the council. A number of men declared opinions to the effect that they should abandon the baggage, charge out, and march to a place of safety along the same route by which they had come. The majority, however, resolved to set this aside as a last resort, and in the meantime to await the outcome of events and defend the camp. 4. In this brief interval, they had just enough time to arrange and contrive matters in the way they had decided at the council before a signal was given and the enemy began to charge down on them from all directions, hurling stones and javelins at the rampart. At first, while they were still fresh, our men fought back bravely, and none of the missiles they cast from the rampart was cast in vain. Also, when any section of the camp had lost its defenders and seemed to be hard pressed, they ran to bring help. But they were at a disadvantage because the fighting went on so long, and because when the enemy grew wary, they could leave the battle and fresh troops took their places. None of this was possible for our men because they were too few in number. In fact, not only were soldiers who were fatigued unable to retire from the fighting, but there was no opportunity even for wounded men to give up the place where they had been posted in order to recover. 5. The battle went on for more than 6 hours without a break. Our men were running out of weapons as well as strength, while the enemy attacked more fiercely as our men grew weary and began to break down the rampart and fill in the ditch. Then, as the affair came to a desperate climax, the senior centurion, Publius Sextus Baculus, we mentioned his numerous injuries in the battle against the Nervi, together with the military tribune Gaius Valescenus, a man most sensible and brave, ran up to Galba and explained that their one hope of salvation was to try a desperate remedy and attempt a sudden sortie. So Galba summoned the centurions and told the men to leave off the fighting gradually and just to intercept enemy weapons and rest after their efforts. Then after the signal to sally out from the camp and put all hope of safety in courage. 6. The men did as they were told. They made a sudden sortie from all the gates of the camp and gave the enemy no chance to realize what was happening or to close ranks. Now the positions were reversed, and men who had come hoping to take the Roman camp were encircled on all sides and put to death. The total number of Gauls who had come to the camp was reckoned at more than 30,000. More than a third of them were killed, and the rest were terrified and put to flight. They were not even allowed to make a stand on the heights. Once the whole enemy force was routed and the bodies of the slain were stripped of their arms, our men returned to their camp and their own defenses. After this battle, Galba was reluctant to take risks too often, and remembered that he had taken up his winter quarters with one set of expectations, but had come face to face with an entirely different set of circumstances. He was particularly worried by the shortage of corn and supplies, and the next day burned all the buildings in the village and set out to return to the province. No enemy barred his way or held up his march. He led his army to the lands of the Chariots, and then the Allobroges, where he wintered. 7. After these events, Caesar had even every reason to think that the whole of Gaul had been subdued, the Belgae beaten, the Germans expelled, and in the Alps the Seduni overcome. So at the start of winter he set out for Illyricum. He wanted to visit these peoples too and acquaint himself with the area. Suddenly, however, war broke out in Gaul. The cause of the war was this. Young Publius Crassus, together with the 7th Legion, had wintered beside the ocean among the people called the Andes. There was very little corn in those parts, so Crassus sent some prefects and military tribunes to neighboring states in search of more supplies. Among them, Titus Tarasidius was sent to the Asubi, Marcus Trebius Gallus to the Curios Solitae, and Quintus Valenius and Titus Silius to the Veneti. 8. The influence of the Veneti is very great indeed along the whole coast in those parts. Not only do they have a large navy, which they use for voyaging to Britain, but they also excel in nautical matters, both theoretical and practical. Since, moreover, they live beside a particularly fierce and open sea, with only a few exposed harbors under their own control, practically everyone who regularly sails in their territorial waters must pay them a tax. The Veneti took the initiative by detaining Silius and Valenius in the expectation of using them to recover the people they had surrendered to Crassus as hostages. The Gauls are impulsive and sudden in their decision-making. The neighboring peoples were influenced by the authority of the Veneti and detained Trebius and Tarasidius on the same grounds. Envoys were quickly dispatched between their leaders, and they swore an oath they would only act by common consent and all would bear the same outcome of fortune. They urged the other states to choose to maintain the liberty they had been given by their ancestors, rather than enduring enslavement to the Romans. The coastal peoples were all swiftly won over to this point of view, and they sent a united embassy to Publius Crassus. If he wanted Silius, Hellenius, Tarasidius, and Trebius back, he must return their hostages to them. 9. Crassus reported these events to Caesar. As he was some distance away, Caesar then gave orders for the building of warships on the river Loire, which flows into the ocean, the appointment of oarsmen from the province, and a muster of sailors and helmsmen. These matters were soon arranged. Then, as soon as the time of year allowed, Caesar made his way to his army. The Veneti and the other states heard of Caesar's arrival and realized how seriously they had wronged him. They had detained envoys who had always in every nation been entitled to be treated as sacrosanct, and put them in chains. So they began to make ready for war in accordance with the magnitude of the threat, and in particular to prepare what was necessary for their navy. They were especially confident because they put their trust in the nature of their territory. They were aware that on land the roads were intersected by inlets, and that it would be hard for the Romans to travel by water, since they were unfamiliar with the area and harbors were few. They were convinced, moreover, that our armies could not remain much longer in the vicinity because of their shortage of corn, and even supposing that events did turn out contrary to their expectations, still they had great seafaring strength, while the Romans had no skill with ships and no knowledge of the waters, harbors, or islands in the areas where the campaign would take place. They also knew that navigating the great unbounded ocean was quite a different matter from sailing in landlocked waters. These plans were adopted. The Veneti fortified their towns and gathered in the corn from the fields. They also assembled as many ships as they could at Venetia, where it was generally agreed that Caesar would begin his campaign. To fight this campaign, they made alliance with the Osismi, Daxovi, Namnetes, Ambliadi, Morini, Diablintes, and Menopi. They also summoned assistance from Britain, which lies opposite those regions. Despite the difficulties of the campaign, which we have just set out, many factors nonetheless encouraged Caesar to undertake the war. The wrong they had done by detaining Roman citizens of equestrian rank, the revival of hostilities following their capitulation, their revolt following the surrender of hostages, and conspiracy among such a large number of states. Most of all, if their behavior was overlooked, the rest of the Gallic peoples might think they could act in a similar fashion. Caesar was aware that almost all Gauls are eager for political change, and, because of their fickleness, are soon roused to war, and also that all men naturally long for liberty and despise a state of servitude. Thus he decided to divide up his army and station it at wider intervals. He sent his legate Titus Labienus with the cavalry against the Treveri, who lived close to the Rhine. Labienus's orders were to approach the Remi and the other Belgae and secure their loyalty, and to prevent the Germans, who the Belgae were rumored to have summoned to their assistance, from trying to force a crossing over the river by boat. Caesar ordered Publius Crassus to take 12 legionary cohorts and a large force of cavalry, and set out for Aquitania, to prevent its people sending reinforcements to Gaul and to stop these great nations joining forces. He sent his legate Quintus Titurius Sabinus with 3 legions to the Venelli, Chrysolite, and Lexovi, to ensure that their force was prevented from joining in. He put young Decimus Brutus in command of the fleet and the Gallic ships belonging to the Pictones, Santoni, and the other conquered regions, which he had ordered to assemble. He ordered Brutus to set out as soon as possible against the Veneti. Caesar himself headed in the same direction, taking all the infantry with him. The sites of their towns were in general of this kind. They were placed on headlands projecting into the sea, and could not be approached on foot when the tide rushed in from the sea, as happened twice every 12 hours. Nor could they be approached by ship at low tide, because then vessels would run into trouble in the shallows, so making an assault upon such a town by either means was an awkward business. For if at any time the Veneti became alarmed by the size of some siege works, or began to despair because the sea was kept out by the piling up of a massive breakwater as high as the town walls, then they would bring a large number of ships to land, a task at which they were especially skilled, take all their property out to sea, and sail off to the nearest town. There they would once again put up their defenses with the same advantages of position. The Veneti continued to do this for a large part of the summer, all the more easily because our ships were held back by bad weather, and on the great expanse of the open sea, with its strong currents and few harbors, if any at all, navigation was especially difficult. The ships of the Veneti were made and armed in the following way. The hulls were rather flatter than on our ships, to make negotiating the shallows and the ebb tides easier. The prows were very high, and likewise the sterns were fashioned to suit the size of the waves and the weather. The ships were made entirely out of oak to withstand any force or rough treatment. The cross timbers which supported the decks were made of planks a foot thick, fastened with iron bolts as thick as a man's thumb. The anchors were attached with iron chains instead of ropes. Instead of sails, they had skins and leather stretched very thin, either because they had no linen or did not know how to use it, or, what is more likely, because they thought that linen sails would not be able to withstand satisfactorily the terrible storms and gale-force winds of the ocean, and the great burden of the ships. The clash between their ships and our fleet revealed that only in speed and oarsmen did our ships have the advantage, while in all other respects their ships were better adapted and suited to the nature of the locality and the severity of the weather. Our ships were unable to harm theirs by ramming them, they were so strongly built, or because of their height, to aim missiles at them with any success. For the same reason, it was difficult to control them with grappling irons. Moreover, when the wind began to whip up, they would run before it and could endure a storm more easily, coming safely to rest in the shallows without fear of rocks or reefs if the tide left them behind. For our ships, on the other hand, every one of these eventualities was a matter of serious concern. 14. Caesar had taken a number of the Veneti's towns by storm, but he realized that his great efforts were all in vain, for he could not check the enemy's flight by capturing towns, nor could he do them any damage. He decided to await the fleet. When it arrived, it was immediately spotted by the enemy. About 220 of the Veneti's ships, all properly equipped and rigged out with all kinds of weaponry, set out against our fleet. Between Brutus, who commanded the fleet, and the military tribunes and centurions who captained the individual vessels, there was no complete agreement over how to proceed or what plan of battle to adopt. They already knew that the ram could inflict no damage, and even if turrets were erected, still the sterns of the barbarian ships were even taller than these, so that our men could not aim missiles satisfactorily from their lower position, while those of the Veneti did all the more harm. One item, however, which our men had made ready in advance, proved to be of especial importance, namely sharpened hooks fixed into long poles, not unlike the kind of hooks used for pulling down walls in sieges. Using these hooks, our men seized the ropes binding the enemy yard arms to the masts and drew them tight. Then our ships quickly rowed away and the ropes broke. Now that the ropes were snapped, the yard arms inevitably fell down. The hopes of the Gallic War ships had depended entirely on their sails and rigging, but when these were taken away, all the advantages of their fleet were removed at a stroke. The rest of the battle depended on courage, in which our soldiers were easily superior, all the more so because the fighting was before the eyes of Caesar and the whole army, so that no action which was at all distinguished for bravery went unnoticed. Our army was positioned on all the hills and heights, which offered a good view onto the sea. 15. Once the yard arms were broken, as we said, and 2 or 3 of our ships had surrounded each of the Venetis, our soldiers battled furiously to climb aboard the enemy vessels. When the barbarians realized what was happening and lost a number of ships, since no reinforcements were available for this action, they tried to seek safety in flight. Now all their ships were turned to sail with the wind, when suddenly a dead calm fell and they were unable to sail away. This calm was certainly most timely in bringing the engagement to an end, for our men chased each enemy vessel and stormed it, and by nightfall almost none of their number had reached land, though the fighting had lasted from about the 4th hour until sunset. 16. With this battle, the campaign against the Veneti and the whole of the coastal region came to an end. All the men capable of active service had assembled there, together with all the older men of sense or prestige. Moreover, they had gathered in one place every ship they possessed anywhere, and now the ships were all lost. They had no way of retreat left to them, nor any means of defending their towns. They therefore surrendered themselves and all their property to Caesar. Caesar decided that their punishment must be severe to make these barbarian peoples uphold the laws of nations more carefully in the future. So he executed all the Senate of the Veneti and sold the rest of the people into slavery. 17. While the campaign against the Veneti was in progress, Quintus Titurius Sabinus arrived in the territory of the Venelli with the forces allocated by Caesar. The leader of the Venelli was called Viridovix. He held the supreme command over all the states which had defected, and had compelled them to provide an army and a large force. Within these few days, the Alarici, Eburovices, and Lexovi had put their senate to death for its reluctance to start a war. They closed their gates and joined forces with Viridovix. Also, there assembled from all over Gaul a huge mob of criminals and brigands who were diverted from farming and daily tasks by the hope of plunder and by their enthusiasm for fighting. Sabinus remained within the camp, which was well sited in all respects. Viridovix encamped facing him barely 2 miles off, and each day led out his forces and offered Sabinus an opportunity to fight. Eventually, Sabinus not only began to be despised by the enemy, but was even sneered at by our soldiers. He conveyed such an impression of fear that the enemy now dared to approach the rampart of the camp. His reason for acting in this way was the conviction that he ought not, as a subordinate, to engage with a great enemy host, especially in the absence of his supreme commander, except on even ground or if some kind of opportunity arose. 18. Once their belief in his cowardice was fixed, Sabinus chose a suitable man of intelligence, a Gaul, from among his auxiliary forces. With all kinds of promises and substantial rewards, Sabinus persuaded the man to go to the enemy and instructed him in what he wanted to happen. Posing as a deserter, the Gaul went to the Venelli and gave an account of the Romans' fear. He described how Caesar was in trouble, hard-pressed by the Veneti, and how by the following night, at the latest, Sabinus would secretly lead his army out of camp and set out to Caesar's assistance. When they heard this, the enemy all clamored that such an opportunity for favorable action should not be lost. They must make their way to Sabinus's camp. Many factors encouraged the Gauls to adopt this strategy. Sabinus's previous hesitancy, the deserters' corroboration, their shortage of rations — they had paid too little attention to this matter — their hope for the Venetic War, and the fact that men are generally ready to believe what they want to believe. Thus encouraged, they did not dismiss Viridovix and the other leaders from the meeting before they had their agreement to take up arms and march on the Roman camp. They rejoiced at this as if victory were already assured, gathered brushwood and faggots to fill up the Roman ditches, and set off for the camp. 19. The site of Sabinus's camp was on a hill which sloped up gradually for about a mile. The Gauls made for it at top speed, so as to give the Romans as little time as possible to muster and arm themselves. When they arrived, however, they were out of breath. Sabinus spoke words of encouragement to his eager men and gave the signal. While the enemy were hindered by the baggage they were carrying, Sabinus suddenly ordered a sortie from the 2 of the gates. Thanks to the advantage of their position, the fatigue and lack of expertise of the enemy, the courage of our men, and their experience in previous battles, the result was that the Venelli did not even withstand our men's first attack, but turned tail. They were in difficulties. Our men, who were still fresh, pursued them as they fled and killed a large number. The cavalry pursued the rest. They left only a few who had got away from the rout. So In the same moment, Sabinus learned of the naval battle, and Caesar learned of Sabinus's victory. All the states at once surrendered to Sabinus, for the Gallic temperament is ready and eager to start wars, but their minds are soft and lacking in determination when it comes to enduring defeats. Hey Liz, how's it going? 20. At about the same time, Publius Crassus had reached Aquitania. This land, as was stated earlier, can be reckoned as 1/3 of Gaul in terms of both territorial size and population. He knew that he must wage war in places where, only a few years before, the legate Lucius Valerius Proconinus had been killed following the rout of his army, and where a proconsul, Lucius Malleus, escaped with his life after losing all the army's baggage, and he knew he needed to exercise no small degree of care. So he saw to it that the corn supply was secure, raised a force of auxiliaries and cavalry, and called up individually a number of brave men besides this from Tolosa and Narbo. These Gallic states are in the province very close to Aquitania. Then he led his army into the territory of the Santiates. The Santiates heard of Crassus's arrival and mustered a large force of men and horses. They were particularly strong in cavalry. Then they attacked the Roman column as it was on the march, and at first began a cavalry battle. But when their cavalry was routed, and ours started to press the attack, they suddenly revealed their infantry, which had been posted in ambush in an enclosed valley. Their soldiers attacked and scattered our cavalry, and began the battle again. The fighting was long and fierce. The Santiates were confident because of past victories and thought that the safety of all Aquitania depended on their bravery. Our men, on the other hand, were eager to show what their youthful leader could accomplish in the absence of his commander and the other legions. The enemy suffered heavy casualties and turned tail. Many of them were slain, and Crassus actually turned from his march to begin besieging the town of the Santiates. They resisted bravely, so he brought up the siege towers and movable shelters. At one point, the Aquitani attempted a sortie. Then, at another, they took mines up to the earthworks and shelters. They are particularly skillful at mining, since they have mines and quarries at a number of sites. When the Aquitani realized that this was achieving nothing, thanks to the perseverance of our men, they sent envoys to Crassus and asked him to accept their surrender. Their request was granted, and they handed over their weapons as ordered. 22. Our minds were all concentrated on this action. From another part of town, meanwhile, the commander Adiatunas attempted a sortie, together with 600 dedicated followers. These followers are called solduri. They have a rule of life to share all their advantages with those to whom they are joined in friendship. If one of them comes to a violent end, they must either endure the same fate together with him or must commit suicide. Never within memory has it been found that one of them refused to die following the death of a man bound to him in friendship. With the attempted sortie, a cry went up from that part of the defenses. Soldiers ran to arms, and a fierce battle began. Adiatunas was forced back into the town. He then asked of Crassus similar terms of surrender, which Crassus granted. 23. Crassus received weapons and hostages and set out for the territory of the Vocates and the Tarasates. When the barbarians heard that he had stormed the town with both natural and man-made defenses, and within a few days of his arrival they were alarmed and sent envoys out in every direction. They began to hatch a plot, exchange hostages, and make ready their forces. They even sent envoys to nearer Spain, to the peoples closest to Aquitania, summoning reinforcements and leaders. When these arrived, they were now possessed of great authority and numbers, and tried to start a war. The leaders they chose were men who had served with Quintus Sertorius right to the end, and who were considered to have immense expertise in military matters. In accordance with the Romans' people's custom, these men began to occupy positions, fortify a camp, and cut our men off from supplies. Crassus became aware that his own forces were too small to be split up easily, while the enemy, though roaming about and blockading the roads, was still able to leave a sufficient garrison in camp. For this reason, the transport of corn and supplies was becoming difficult, and enemy numbers were growing daily, so he decided to fight it out without delay. He referred to his decision to a council, and when he realized that everyone supported his view, he decided to give battle the next day. 24. At dawn, Crassus led out his entire force and stationed the men in a double line, putting the auxiliaries in the center of the line. Then he waited to see what the enemy's decision would be. The Gauls thought they could engage with impunity because of their great numbers and their long-established glorious reputation in warfare, and because our men were so few. Nevertheless, they decided it was safer to continue blockading the roads and cutting off supplies, and thus to seize victory without suffering harm. Moreover, they thought that if the Romans started to retreat because of their lack of corn, they could attack them while they were encumbered with baggage on the march, and hence in poor heart. The leaders of the Gauls approved this plan, and although the Roman forces were let out, they remained in camp. Crassus took note of the fact, but by delaying and appearing to be frightened, the enemy had made our men more eager to fight. They were all heard to shout that there should be no delay in marching to the enemy camp. So Crassus spoke words of encouragement to all his men and set out against the camp of the enemy. 25. When they reached the camp, some of Crassus's men filled in the ditches, while others threw large numbers of missiles and forced the defenders back from the rampart and the defenses. He could not trust the auxiliaries sufficiently for battle, but he allotted them the task of supplying stones and missiles and fetching turves for the Roman earthworks, so that they gave the appearance and impression of being fighting men. At the same time, the enemy fought fearlessly and without wavering, and the missiles they cast from their higher position did not fall in vain. Then some of our cavalry went around the enemy camp and reported back to Crassus that the main gate at the back of the camp had not been fortified with equal care, and offered as easy means of entry. 26. Crassus urged his cavalry officers to rouse their men with promises of great rewards. Then he explained that what he wanted to happen. As ordered, they let out the cohorts which had been left to garrison our camp, and so were not worn out by exertion. The cavalry commanders took them by a somewhat roundabout route to avoid being spotted by the enemy camp. But all eyes were turned to the battle, all minds concentrated upon it, and they swiftly reached the defenses we mentioned, demolished them, and took up position in the enemy camp before they had even been clearly observed, and before the enemy knew what was happening. Then a shout went up from the quarter, and our men, their strength renewed, began to fight more fiercely, as so often happens when there is hope of victory. The enemy were encircled on all sides, abandoned hope, and struggled to force a way through the defenses and seek safety in flight. The cavalry pursued them over the open plains, then returned to camp when the night was far spent. Out of the total of 50,000 men known to have assembled from Aquitania and Calabria, barely a quarter was left. 27. Once news of the battle spread, most of the Aquitani surrendered to Crassus and handed over hostages of their own accord. These included the Tarbelli, Bigoriones, Pitiani, Vocades, Tarasutis, Elusates, Gates, Ausci, Garumni, Sebuzates, and Cocasades. A few of the most distant peoples, however, trusted to the onset of winter and failed to surrender like the rest. 28. The campaigning season was almost over, but although all Gaul was now subdued, the Morini and the Menapes still remained ready for war, and had never sent envoys to discuss peace. At almost the same time, therefore, Caesar decided that a war against them could be quickly concluded, and led his army against them. The Morini and the Menapi, however, started the war with tactics very different from those employed by other Gauls. They realized that the mighty nations which had engaged in pitched battles had been routed and beaten. They, however, possessed woods and marshlands nearby, into which they shifted with all their property. Caesar arrived at the border of the woods and started building his camp, but during this time there was not an enemy in sight. Then, when our men spread out at work, the enemy suddenly rushed out of every part of the wood and attacked them. Swiftly our men seized their weapons and forced the enemy back into the woods. A number of them were killed, but our men pursued too far into the impenetrable areas and lost a few of their comrades. 29. Then, in the time remaining, Caesar had all the trees felled to prevent any lateral attacks on the soldiers while they were unarmed and unawares. He had all the felled timber placed on the side facing the enemy and built up as a rampart on either flank. In only a few days, a large space was cleared with unbelievable speed. Our men captured the enemy's cattle and the baggage at the rear. The enemy made for the depths of the forest. Then such storms arose that the tree felling had to be discontinued. The endless rain made it impossible to keep the soldiers any longer in tents, so they devastated the enemy's fields and set fire to their villages and buildings. After this, Caesar led his army back and stationed them for the winter amongst the Alarici and Laxovi, and the other states which had so recently undertaken hostilities. Alright, that's end of book 3. I'm doing well. Had a little late start, but we're good. And it's not as warm as it's been, so I just have one little fan going. It's nice. 80 degrees. All right, ready for the 4th book? All right. But wait, there's more. There's always more. All right. The 4th book, 55 BC. AUC 699. Consuls Pompey, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Invasion of the Usipetes and Tencteri, crossing of the Rhine, Caesar in Britain. 1. During the winter which followed, the year of the consulship of Pompey and Marcus Crassus, the Usipetes and Tencteri, 2 German peoples, crossed the Rhine with a large host of men not far from the sea into which the river flows. Their reason for making the crossing was this. For a number of years, the Suebi had been attacking them and making war upon them, and preventing them from farming their land. The Suebi are by far the greatest and most aggressive of all the German peoples. It is said that they possess 100 villages, from each of which they take 1,000 armed men every year for waging war outside their own territory. The men who have remained at home support both themselves and those who are abroad. Then the following year they take their turn under arms, while the others stay at home. In this way, both agriculture and the theory and practice of warfare continue without interruption. There is, however, no private or individual landholding among them, nor is it permissible to remain dwelling in one place for more than a year. They consume little corn, but for the most part live off milk and cattle, and spend much of their time hunting. This activity, together with their diet, daily exercise, and the freedom of their way of life, from childhood they are unaccustomed to duty or discipline, and so do nothing whatsoever against their will, nourishes their strength, and produces men of enormous physical stature. They have, moreover, trained themselves by constant practice, so that however cold the region, they wear no other clothing than skins, which are so small that most of the body is left uncovered, and they bathe in the rivers. 2. They do allow traders access, but rather with a view to having buyers for their spoils of war than because they want anything imported. Furthermore, the Germans do not import for their use the kind of pack horse which the Gauls so delight in and pay high prices for. They take their own native animals, which are deformed and ugly, and by training them every day make them capable of extreme hard work. During cavalry battles, they often jump down from their mounts and fight on foot, for they have trained their horses to remain on the same spot and then quickly retreat to them in time of need. According to their standards, there is nothing more disgraceful or feeble than using saddles, and so, however few they may be, they will boldly move up to attack any number of cavalry men on saddled mounts. They forbid the import of wine altogether, believing that it makes men weak and womanish in their capacity for exertion. 3. As a community, they consider it the greatest credit to have as wide, attractive territory as possible next to their borders, as a means of indicating how many states are unable to withstand their strength. Thus, on one side of the land bordering the territory of the Suebi is said to be unoccupied for about 600 miles. On the other, the Ubai are close by, but by German standards, theirs is a large and flourishing nation, and somewhat more civilized than the rest of their race. This is because they live beside the Rhine, and traders come to them frequently, and because they are themselves close enough to the Gauls to have become accustomed to their way of life. The Suebi had waged war upon the Ubai many times, but owing to their numbers and importance had failed to expel them from their land. Nevertheless, they made them pay a tribute and reduced them to a state of greater subservience and inferiority. 4. The Usopetes and Tencteri, whom we mentioned above, were in similar position. They had endured the aggression of the Suebi for a number of years, but were finally expelled from their land and spent 3 years wandering in many parts of Germany before coming to the Rhine. The Menapii were living in these regions and had lands, buildings, and settlements on either bank of the river. But they were so terrified by the arrival of this vast host that they evacuated their buildings over the river, set up garrisons along the nearer bank, and forbade the Germans to cross. The Germans, meanwhile, tried everything, but when they could neither fight their way across because they had no boats, nor cross in secret because the Menapi's guards, they pretended to return to their own territory and their homes. After 3 days' journey, they turned back. Their cavalry completed the entire return journey in a single night and attacked the Menapii, who had been told by the scouts of the Germans' departure and had confidently returned to their settlements across the Rhine, catching them off guard and unawares. They killed them and seized their boats, then crossed the river before those of the Menapii who were on this side of the Rhine found out what was happening. Then they took control of their buildings and spent the rest of the winter living off the Menapi's provisions. 5. Caesar was informed of this action. He was anxious about the instability of the Gauls, for they are quick to take decision and ever eager for political change. So he decided not to trust them in anything, for the Gauls make a practice of obliging travelers to stop, even against their will, and of questioning them as to what each one has heard or discovered on every subject. In the towns, a crowd surrounds traders and forces them to declare every place they have come from and every matter they learn there. These factors and rumors often prompt them to take decisions on matters of great importance which they are instantly made to think better of, for they are slaves to vacillating rumors, and most men give them answers made up to suit Gallic wishes. 6. When Caesar learned of this practice, he set out to join his army sooner than usual, so as to avoid finding himself confronting a more serious war. Once he joined the army, Caesar realized that what he had feared would happen had in fact occurred. A number of states had sent embassies to the Germans, inviting them to leave the Rhine and promising to procure for them everything they had stipulated. The Germans were encouraged by this hope to roam more widely and penetrate the territory of the Eburones and the Condrusi, who are dependents of the Treveri. Caesar summoned the Gallic leaders, but thought it best to conceal what he had discovered. So he soothed and reassured them and decided to levy a force of cavalry and to wage war against the Germans. 7. Once the corn supply was secured and the levy of cavalry complete, he began the march into the regions where he heard the Germans were located. When he was only a few days' march away, they sent envoys who made a speech declaring that the Germans had never been the aggressors in the waging war upon the Roman people, but they were not refusing to start a fight if they suffered any injury. For the Germans had a custom handed down from their ancestors of resisting anyone who made war upon them, and of not suing for peace. They went on to state that they had come against their will after being thrown out of their homes. If the Romans wanted their goodwill, they might find them useful friends. So they concluded the Romans must either give them land or allow them to hold on to what they had already won by force of arms. They gave way only to the Suebi, for whom not even the immortal gods were a match. Certainly there was no one else on earth whom they could not conquer. All right. 8. Caesar made an appropriate reply to this, but his speech ended by stating that there could be no friendship between them and himself if they remained in Gaul. It was not fair that men who had failed to protect their own territory should be occupying another people's land, nor was there any land in Gaul available to be given out without doing an injustice, especially since they were so very numerous. Even so, if they wished, they might settle in the territory of the Ubi, whose envoys were presently with him, complaining of outrages done by the Suebi and asking his help. He would issue the Ubi with orders to this effect. 9. The envoys said that they would report back to their own people, and after considering the matter would come back to Caesar in 3 days. Meanwhile, they asked him not to move his camp any closer. Caesar replied that he was unable to grant even that request, for he had learned that several days previously they had sent a large division of cavalry across the Meuse to loot and forage for corn in the land of the Ambivaridi, and he thought that they were awaiting the cavalry's return, and that this was the reason they were proposing a delay. 10. The Meuse flows from the Vosges mountain range in the territory of the Lingones, and is joined by a distributary of the Rhine called the Wall, so forming the island of the Batavi. It flows into the Rhine no more than 80 miles from the ocean. The Rhine, however, has its sources in the land of the Leponti, who live in the Alps. For a long distance it flows swiftly through the territories of the Nantuates, Helvetii, Sequani, Mediomatrices, Triboci, and Treveri. But when it reaches the ocean, it separates into several channels, thus forming a large number of sizable islands before it flows from many mouths into the ocean. Most of the islands are inhabited by fierce barbarian peoples, some of which are thought to live on fish and birds' eggs. 11. When Caesar was no more than 11 miles from the enemy, the envoys returned to him as had been agreed. They met him on the march and urgently requested him not to proceed further. When they failed to attain this objective, they asked him to send ahead to the cavalry, who were in the front of the main column, and order them not to engage, and to grant them permission to send an embassy to the Ubi. They made it clear that if this embassy won the sworn support of the Senate and the leading citizens of the Ubi, they would themselves accept the terms Caesar was offering and ask for an interval of 3 days in which to accomplish these objectives. Caesar was of the opinion that all these suggestions were directed at the same end, namely, securing a delay of 3 days in which their absent cavalry could return. Even so, he declared that he would go no further than 4 miles that day in search of water, and he ordered them to assemble there in full strength the following day, so that he could learn what it was they were requesting. Meanwhile, he sent messengers to the prefects who had gone ahead with all the cavalry to tell them not to provoke the enemy into fighting, and if they were themselves provoked, to withstand any assault until he had drawn closer with the army. Hmm. 12. As soon, however, as the enemy caught sight of our cavalry, which was 5,000 in number, they at once attacked and threw our men into confusion. This was despite the fact that they possessed no more than 800 horse, because those who had crossed the Meuse in search of corn had not yet returned. They were in no way afraid of our men, since their envoys had just recently departed from Caesar after requesting a truce that day. Our men returned to resist them. Then, as was their usual practice, they dismounted, stabbed our horses, pulled a number of our men down, and routed the rest. They caused such a panic among our men that they did not stop running until they came in sight of our column. 74 of our cavalry were killed in the battle, among them a man of outstanding courage called Piso, an Aquitanian Gaul. He was of a wealthy family. His grandfather had obtained royal power in his own state and been called friend by our Senate. He went to the assistance of his brother, who was hemmed in by the enemy, and snatched him from danger. But his horse was wounded, and he was thrown. He fought bravely, so far as he was able, but was surrounded, sustained many wounds, and fell. His brother had already left the battle, but when he saw this from far away, he spurred his horse on, exposed himself to the enemy, and was killed. 13. After the battle, Caesar decided not to give audience to any more envoys, or to accept any terms from men who had first sought peace and then had used snares and treachery to make war unprovoked. Indeed, he judged it the height of folly to wait until the cavalry returned and the enemy's forces were enlarged. He knew how unreliable were his Gallic allies, and he was aware how much prestige the enemy had acquired among them as a result of this one battle. He therefore concluded that the Gauls should be allowed no time to hold discussions. These matters were settled, and he had communicated his plan of not letting a day for battle be missed to his legates and his quaestor, when a most timely event occurred. The very next day, a large crowd of Germans, employing the same treacherous hypocrisy as before, called upon all their leading citizens and elders, and came into the camp to see Caesar. They claimed that their intention was to make their excuses for starting a battle in contravention of what had been stated and what they themselves had requested, but at the same time they really intended to use deceit to obtain whatever they could in terms of a truce. Caesar was delighted that they had put themselves in his power and gave orders for them to be detained. He himself led all his forces out of camp. Because he judged that the cavalry had panicked in the recent battle, he ordered it to follow at the rear of the column. 14. He arranged his forces in a triple column, and by completing a 7-mile march swiftly reached the enemy camp before the Germans could be aware what was happening. They were in a sudden panic at the whole state of affairs, our rapid approach, the departure of their leaders, and the lack of time to decide on a strategy or take up arms threw them into confusion as to whether it was best to lead their forces out against the enemy, or defend their camp, or seek safety in flight. Shouting and running to and fro betrayed their fear. Then our soldiers, goaded by the previous day's treachery, broke into their camp. There those who were able to grab weapons quickly resisted our men for a little while, and gave battle among the wagons and heavy baggage. The Germans had departed from their homes and crossed the Rhine with all their possessions. The crowd of women and children which remained began to flee in all directions. Caesar sent his cavalry to hunt them down. 15. The Germans heard the shouting at their back, and when they saw their own people being killed, they threw away their weapons, abandoned their military standards, and burst out of camp. When they reached the confluence of the Meuse and Rhine, they abandoned hope of fleeing further, and a large number were killed. The rest flung themselves into the river, and there they perished, overpowered by fear, fatigue, and the strength of the current. Every one of our men survived. A few, however, were wounded. They had returned to camp, and this despite their previous anxiety about such a large-scale campaign and the fact that the enemy numbered 430,000. Caesar gave the Germans, whom he had detained in camp, the chance to leave, but they were afraid of punishment and torture at the hands of the Gauls, whose lands they had devastated, and declared that they wanted to remain with him. Caesar granted the freedom to do so. 16. Once the German campaign was over, Caesar decided that for a number of reasons it was imperative he should cross the Rhine. The most compelling of these reasons was that now he had seen how easily the Germans were induced to invade Gaul, he wanted them to experience fear on their own account. When they realized that the army of the Roman people was both capable of crossing the Rhine and brave enough to venture it. There was also the fact that after the flight of their comrades, the detachment of cavalry of the Usipetes and Tencteri, which, as I mentioned above, had crossed the Meuse in search of corn and plunder and had not taken part in the battle, had retreated over the Rhine into the territory of the Sugambri, and made alliance with them. When Caesar sent messengers to them to demand the surrender of those men who had made war upon himself in Gaul, they replied that the Rhine marked the boundary of the rule of the Roman people. If Caesar thought it wrong for Germans to cross into Gaul against his wishes, why was he claiming any rule or power across the Rhine? The Ubi, however, alone of all the peoples across the Rhine, had sent envoys to Caesar and made a treaty of friendship. They had surrendered hostages and pleaded forcefully for him to come to their aid. as they were being harassed by the Suebi. If the affairs of the Republic were too pressing to allow him to come, he could just transport his army over the Rhine. That would be enough to help them and bring hope for the future. The fame and reputation of Caesar's army, they went on, was so renowned because of the expulsion of Ariovistus and the war so recently waged against even the most distant German nations that the reputation and friendship of the Roman people could protect them. They pledged themselves to provide a large supply of boats to transport the army. For the reason which I mentioned, Caesar had determined to cross the Rhine, but as far as crossing by boat was concerned, he judged that it was not sufficiently safe, and he was not convinced that such a method of crossing was in accord with either his own dignity or that of the Roman people. So, despite the extreme difficulty of the task of constructing a bridge which lay before him, because the river was so broad, swift, and deep, nonetheless he concluded that he must attempt the crossing by bridge or not take his army across at all. The plan of the bridge was as follows. Pairs of piles 18 inches thick and sharpened at the end were measured to suit the depth of the river and joined together with a 2-foot gap between them. Rafts and cranes were used to lower the piles into the riverbed, and rams to drive them home, not vertical and straight down like stakes, but lying at an angle so that they leaned into the current. Opposite these, and 40 feet away on the riverbed, more pairs of piles were joined in the same way and set at an angled slope, this time against the force and flow of the current. From above, cross beams 2 feet thick were fitted into the opposing pairs of piles to fill the gap and join them together to form trestles. Twin braces at the ends of each pair of piles kept them apart. Thus the main piles were arranged in an opposing manner, both held apart and bound together. As a consequence, the structure was extremely secure and of such a nature that the greater the force of the water pressing upon it, the more firmly its joints were held in position. The trestles were covered over with planks, which joined them lengthways, and also with poles and bundles of rods. Even so, more piles were driven in at an angle further downstream to serve as props for the bridge. Attached to the entire structure, they absorbed the force of the current. Finally, more piles were driven in a little way upstream. If the barbarians launched logs or ships to demolish the bridge, these would protect it from being damaged by weakening the impact of such objects. Within 10 days of the materials being gathered together, the entire structure was completed, and the army transported across. Caesar left a strong garrison at either end of the bridge and set out for the territory of the Sugambri. During this time, envoys from a number of states approached him to ask for peace and friendship. He replied in generous terms and told them to bring him hostages. The Sugambri, encouraged by some of the Tencteri and Isepetes who were with them, had been making ready for flight ever since the construction of the bridge began. Now they departed from their own land, carried off all their property, and hid themselves in the isolated parts of the forest. 19. Caesar lingered a few days in their territory, set fire to all their settlements and buildings, and cut down the corn. Then he retreated to the land of the Ubi. When he promised them his help if they were troubled by the Suebi, they gave him the following information. After the Suebi had learned through scouts that a bridge was being constructed, they had held an assembly, as was their custom, and then sent messengers in every direction, telling the people to move out of the towns and to find shelter for their children, wives, and all their property in the woods. All who were able to bear arms were to assemble in one place, and the place they chose was almost in the center of the territory controlled by the Suebi. They were waiting here for the arrival of the Romans, where they had decided to give battle. By the time Caesar discovered this, he had already accomplished all the objectives for which he had decided to take the army across, namely, terrorizing the Germans, wreaking vengeance on the Sugambri, and liberating the Ubi from a blockade. So after spending a total of 18 days on the other side of the Rhine, he judged they had achieved enough in terms of both honor and advantage, returned to Gaul, and tore down the bridge. 20. The campaign season was almost over, and because the whole of the Gaul looks northwards, winter comes early in these regions. Despite these facts, Caesar changed his course to set out for Britain, aware as he was that our enemies in almost all our wars with the Gauls had received reinforcements from that quarter. He considered, moreover, that even if the season left no time for a campaign, nonetheless it would be a great advantage to him to simply land on the island and observe the kind of people who lived there, and the localities, harbors, and approaches. Every one of these points was unknown to almost all the Gauls. No one except for traders went there as a matter of course, and not even they knew everything beyond the coastline and the areas facing Gaul. Thus, when Caesar summoned traders from every region, he was unable to ascertain either the size of the island, the nature and numbers of the peoples living there, their skills in warfare, their established customs, or which harbors were suitable for a fleet of fairly large ships. 21. Before making the landing attempt, he needed information in all these matters, and he judged it appropriate to send Gaius Volusenus ahead with a warship. He gave Volusenus instructions to make a thorough reconnoiter and return to him as soon as possible. Then Caesar set out with all his forces for the territory of the Morini, from where the crossing to Britain was shortest. He gave orders for the ships from the surrounding areas, together with the fleet which he had constructed the previous summer for the campaign against the Veneti, to gather there. Meanwhile his plan became known, and traders relayed it to the Britons. Then envoys approached him from several of the island's communities. They promised to surrender hostages and to obey the rule of the Roman people. Caesar heard them and made generous pledges, encouraging them to remain loyal to their avowed intentions. Then he sent them home, and with them Commius, a man whom he had made king over the Trebades after conquering them. He thought highly of Commius's courage and good sense, and believed him to be loyal to himself. Moreover, Commius was thought to possess considerable influence in the area. Caesar ordered Commius to approach with what communities he could, urge them to choose loyalty to the Roman people, and declare that Caesar would soon be coming there. Volusenus had spied out the whole area as best he could, considering that he did not dare to disembark and put his safety in barbarian hands. Then he returned to Caesar on the 5th day and reported what he had observed. (22) While Caesar lingered in the area to make ready his fleet, envoys approached him from the majority of the Morini. They made excuses for their strategy of the previous season, on the grounds that it was because they were barbarians and unaccustomed to our ways that they had made war on the Roman people, and they pledged themselves to carry out whatever Caesar ordered. He considered this circumstance most timely, for he was reluctant to leave an enemy at his back. Also, because the season was so advanced, he had no chance of undertaking a campaign against them. He concluded that involvement in such trivial affairs ought not to come before the expedition to Britain. So he demanded from the Morini a large number of hostages, and as soon as these were produced, he received them under his protection. About 80 transport vessels were mustered and collected, a number Caesar considered sufficient to ferry 2 legions across. Besides this, he divided up the warships in his possession between his quaestor, legates, and prefects. There were also 18 transport vessels approaching, but a strong wind was holding them back about 7 miles off and preventing them from sailing into the same harbor. He assigned these to the cavalry. He handed over the rest of the army to his legates Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurenucleus Cotta. They were to lead it against the Menapii, and against those districts of the Morini which had sent him no envoys. He ordered his legate Publius Sulpicius Rufus to guard the harbor, and with a garrison of his size he considered sufficient. 23. These matters settled, he took advantage of a spell of good weather for sailing, and weighed anchor around the 3rd watch. He ordered the cavalry to advance to the farther port, embark there, and follow him. They were rather late in carrying out the order, but he reached Britain with the first ships at around the 4th hour. There he spied the enemy forces, fully armed and drawn up all along the cliffs. Such was the geography of this place, and so steep the cliffs which bounded the sea, that it was possible for missiles cast from the heights to find their target on the shore. He judged this place wholly unsuitable for disembarkation, so waited at anchor until the rest of the fleet arrived at the 9th hour. Meanwhile he summoned his legates and military tribunes, and set out for what he learned from Volusenus and what he wanted done. He also warned them that the military procedure, and especially naval operations, which tend to be subject to instantaneous and irregular changes, required them to carry out all their tasks at a nod and at the right moment. After dismissing them and taking advantage of a favorable wind and tied together, he gave the signal and weighed anchor. He sailed about 6.5 miles further on and landed on a flat and open shore. The barbarians, however, had grasped the Roman strategy and sent their cavalry on ahead, and their charioteers, it is their usual custom to use chariots in battle. They followed on with the rest of their forces and prevented our men from disembarking. This led to extreme difficulties because the ships were too large to be breached except in deep water, while the soldiers, ignorant of the land, their hands full, weighed down by the size and weight of their weapons, at one and the same time, had to jump down from the ships, find their feet in the surf, and fight the enemy. The Britons, on the other hand, were either on dry ground or in shallow water, their limbs unencumbered, the ground very familiar. They cast missiles boldly and spurred on their horses, which were well used to such work. This led to panic among our men, who were wholly unaccustomed to this style of fighting, and thus did not display the same eagerness and enthusiasm as they habitually did in infantry engagements. 25. When Caesar observed this, he gave orders for the warships, which were of a type less familiar to the barbarians and more maneuverable at need, to be moved a short distance from the transport vessels, rowed at speed, and halted on the enemy's exposed flank. From there, the enemy could be repelled and driven off with slings and arrows and artillery machines. This act was of great assistance to our men. The barbarians were thrown into a panic by the appearance of the ships, the movement of the oars, and the unfamiliar machines. They halted and then retreated a short distance. Meanwhile, our soldiers were hesitating, chiefly because the sea was so deep. Then the man who carried the eagle of the 10th Legion appealed to the gods to see that his action turned out well for the legion, and said, "Jump down, soldiers, unless you want to betray our eagle to the enemy. I at least shall have done my duty to the Republic and to my commander." He cried these words in a loud voice, then flung himself away from the ship and began to carry the eagle towards the enemy. Then our men urged each other to prevent such a disgrace, and all together jumped down from the ship. When the men who were on the closest nearby ships saw them do this, they followed them and drew close to the enemy. 26. Both sides fought fiercely. Nonetheless, our men could not keep ranks or get a firm foothold. Neither were they able to follow the standards. Rather, different men from different ships grouped round whatever standard they ran up against, and they were in great confusion. The enemy, however, knew all the shallows, so when they caught sight from the shore of some of our men disembarking, one by one, they spurred their horses on and attacked while our men were still at a disadvantage, their many surrounding our few. Some began throwing weapons against a whole group of our men on their exposed side. When Caesar noticed this, he gave orders for the boats of the warships and likewise the scout ships to be filled with soldiers. Wherever he saw men struggling, there he dispatched assistance. As soon as our men stood on dry ground, closely followed by all their comrades, they charged the enemy and routed them. But they could not pursue them very far, because the cavalry had failed to hold its course and reach the island. This was the one action in which Caesar's previous good fortune was found lacking. 27. The enemy had been beaten in battle. As soon as they recovered from their rout, they at once sent envoys to Caesar to discuss peace terms. They promised to provide hostages and to do whatever he told them. Together with these envoys, there came Commius of the Atrebates. I have already described how Caesar sent him on ahead to Britain. When he disembarked and delivered Caesar's demands to them in the role of envoy, they had arrested him and cast him into chains, but when the battle was ended, they sent him back. And seeking peace, they blamed the common crowd for what had taken place, and begged him to pardon their lack of judgment. Caesar complained that although of their own accord they had sent envoys to the Gallic mainland to seek peace, they had then started a war with no reason. Then he declared a pardon for their lack of judgment and demanded hostages. A number of these were surrendered at once. Others were summoned from outlying areas and, they claimed, would be handed over in a few days' time. Meanwhile, they ordered their men to return to their lands, and their leaders began to assemble from all directions and commit themselves and their states to Caesar. 28. These acts established the peace. 4 days after the arrival in Britain, the 18 ships which had transported the cavalry, and which were mentioned above, set sail with a gentle breeze, and left their more distant port. When they were drawing near to Britain and were spied from the camp, suddenly a storm arose, which was so fierce that not one of the ships could hold her course. Some were carried back to the place from which they had set out. Others, in terrible danger, were swept further down the island's coast, in a westerly direction. They cast anchor, but began to fill with seawater, and were thus forced to sail out to sea during a stormy night and make for the Gallic mainland. 29. As it happened, there was a full moon that night. On this day, the ocean tides are usually at their highest, a fact of which our men were unaware. So at one and the same time, the tide had flooded the warships by which Caesar had had the army ferried across, in which he had beached, and the storm began to inflict damage on the transport vessels, which were fast at anchor. Nor did our men get any chance to maneuver them or bring them assistance. Several of the ships were wrecked, the rest had lost their ropes, their anchors, and the rest of their rigging, and were unfit to sail. The inevitable result was panic throughout the army, for there was no other ship to transport them back, and they had no materials of use for naval repairs. Moreover, since it was generally established that they must winter in Gaul, no corn had been provided for wintering in Britain. 30. Once they learned of the British leaders who had approached Caesar after the battle held talks among themselves. They realized that the Romans had neither cavalry nor ships nor corn, and understood from the smallest of the camps their weakness in manpower. Circumstances all the more straightened by reason of the fact that Caesar had brought the legions over without their heavy baggage. Thus they considered it the perfect moment to engineer a renewal of hostilities, to cut our men off from the corn and supplies, and prolong the action into the winter. They were confident of overcoming our men or cutting off their escape, and so ensuring that no one would ever again cross to Britain to wage war. So they plotted together once more and began to leave camp a few at a time and to call their men back in secret from the fields. (31) Even though Caesar had not yet learned of their plans, nonetheless he suspected it would happen, both because of the fate which had befallen his ships and because the Britons had left off the handover of the hostages. So he began to prepare safeguards for every eventuality. Every day he gathered corn from the fields into the camp, and he used timber and bronze from the ships which had been most badly damaged to repair the rest. He gave orders for equipment to be ferried over from the mainland Gaul for this purpose. The soldiers carried out these tasks with great enthusiasm, and so by the loss of 12 ships, Caesar was able to render the rest sufficiently seaworthy. 32. While this was going on, the legion known as the 7th had been sent out in a body as usual to find corn. As yet no hint of hostilities had occurred, since some of the Britons were still in the fields, while others were even making frequent visits to the Roman camp. Then the men on guard at the gates of the camp reported to Caesar that a dust cloud greater than usual was visible in the place to which the 7th had marched. Caesar guessed the truth, that the barbarians had started upon some new stratagem. He gave orders for the cohorts which were then on guard to set out with him to the place, and for 2 cohorts from the remainder to relieve them on guard duty. The rest were to arm themselves and follow him without delay. When they had made their way some distance from the camp, he caught sight of his men, and being hard pressed by the enemy and struggling to hold their position. The legion was crowded together, and missiles were being thrown at it from every quarter. Because all the corn had been cut from the remaining areas, and this place alone was left, the enemy had suspected that our men would come there and had hidden by night in the woods. Then, when our men scattered and busy cutting corn had laid down their weapons, they suddenly attacked, killed a few, cast the remainder into disorder before they could form ranks, and surrounded them at once with cavalry and chariots. 33. Their method of fighting from chariots is as follows. First, they drive around in all directions, casting missiles and generally throwing army ranks into confusion through the panic caused by the horses and the noise of the wheels. Then, when they have wormed their way in between the cavalry squadrons, they jump down from the chariots and fight on foot. Meanwhile, the charioteers gradually make their way out of the fighting and station their chariots so that, if they are hard pressed by a host of enemies, they have a speedy retreat to their own side. Thus they provide the flexible mobility of cavalry and the stability of infantry in battle. By means of daily practice and exercises, they ensure that even on the steepest of inclines they can hold their horses at full gallop, control and turn them swiftly, run along the beam and stand on the yoke, and from there get quickly back to the chariot. 34. Because this type of fighting was so unusual, our men were thrown into confusion by such tactics. But in the nick of time, Caesar brought them assistance. For the enemy halted at his coming, while our men recovered from their panic. After this, he considered that it was an inopportune moment for going on the offensive and engaging in battle, so he stayed where he was, and after a short while led the legions back to camp. During these events, all our men were busy, and the rest of the Britons who were in the fields dispersed. Continual storms followed for a number of days, which kept our men in camp and prevented the enemy from fighting. In the meantime, the barbarians sent out messengers in all directions, who proclaimed to their own people that our troops were few in number, and declared how great was the opportunity of winning booty and of liberating themselves forever if they drove the Romans from their camp. In this way, a huge force of infantry and cavalry was quickly mustered and approached our camp. 35. Caesar foresaw the same thing would happen as on previous days, namely that if they were repulsed, the enemy would use speed to escape the danger. Nevertheless, he had in his possession about 30 cavalrymen whom Commius and Attribution, whom was mentioned above, Commius the Attribution, who was mentioned above, had brought across with him. So he stationed his legions in battle formation in front of the camp. Battle was joined. The enemy was unable to withstand the attack of our soldiers for very long, and fled. Our men pursued for as far as their vigor and strength allowed, killed a number of them, then set fire to all the buildings far and wide, and returned to the camp. 36. On the same day, the enemy sent out envoys to Caesar to sue for peace. Caesar doubled the number of hostages which he had previously demanded from them, and ordered that they be taken to the Gallic mainland, because the autumnal equinox was at hand, and he considered that as ships were damaged, the voyage should not be exposed to winter storms. He took advantage of a period of good weather and set sail a little after midnight. All the ships reached the mainland safely, though 2 of the transport vessels were unable to make the same ports as the rest, and were carried a little further south down the coast. 37. About 300 soldiers had disembarked from these ships and were marching to the camp when the Morini, whom Caesar had left pacified when he set out for Britain, were led by the hope of booty to surround them with at first a small number of men. They ordered our men to lay down their weapons if they did not wish to be killed. Our men, however, formed a circle and began to defend themselves. Then about 6,000 of the Morini massed swiftly on hearing the shout. News of this came to Caesar, who sent the entire cavalry to his men's assistance from the camp. Meanwhile, our soldiers withstood the attack of the enemy and fought bravely for more than 4 hours, receiving only a few wounds and killing several of the enemy. After our cavalry came into sight, the enemy threw away their weapons and turned tail. Many of them were killed. The following day, Caesar sent his legate, Titus Labienus, with the legions he had brought back from Britain against the Morini, who had renewed hostilities. The marshes which they had used as a refuge in the previous year were too dry to offer a place of retreat, so almost all surrendered themselves to Labienus's control. The legates Quintus Titurius and Lucius Cotta, meanwhile, had led their legions into the territory of the Menapii. There they ravaged the fields, cut down the corn, and burned the buildings, because the Menapii had concealed themselves in the depths of the forests. Then they returned to Caesar, who established winter quarters for all the legions among the Belgae, and only 2 of the British people sent him hostages there, while the rest failed to do so. Following receipt of a dispatch from Caesar, a thanksgiving of 20 days was decreed by the Senate for these achievements. Alright, that's the end of Book 4. And I'm considering should I continue or stop? I think we're going to stop here because my voice is starting to go. So, I'm a bit short today. Only an hour and 15 minutes about. But I really don't want to strain my voice further. So, that's it for reading today. I'll be back next Monday for the next 2 books, at least. We'll see. And eventually I'll upload this to YouTube. So anyone who's still there, thanks for hanging. I'll see you tomorrow for games, maybe. Later.